utter contempt. And the rest of the people in India are told, don't even touch them because they're dirty and they're filth, they're going to come on you, so don't associate with them, don't touch them. Now, to keep their caste pure and guarantee that they would keep the wealth of their caste within that caste, they had rules that you could not marry outside of your caste. Now, I want to digress a little bit. Now, if you talk to a man from India today, he will tell you, oh, we don't have that anymore. We don't have pariahs anymore. We don't have untouchables. He'll talk to an American that way because he knows Americans are hard against setting up people as being total outcasts and untouchables. And on paper, that's true. In reality, they still have their caste system. And in reality, you still can be killed by your parents, your neighbors, if you marry or associate outside of your caste. Just like in our own history, we passed laws that black men could vote. It was the 15th Amendment passed in 1868. By 1968, a lot of blacks were still not voting 100 years later. You know, what the law said and the actual practice. Same way in India. What their law says that they've outlawed the practice of the caste, and caste people from one caste are allowed to marry another. But folk, there was a case right here in the United States where that a young Indian girl dated another Indian man from a different caste. Her father killed her. The case went to court because in our country this is considered a crime, and this man said, I was practicing my religion. I thought we had religious freedom here. And the judge said, no, our religious freedom does not extend that far. You're guilty of murder. Again, this crime occurred here in the United States. At least one of you might remember it. I teach a few people in my class was claiming they remember the case. So, you know, it still goes on. And I'm personally acquainted with an Indian couple who married into a different caste, and they're looked on as being outcast by their own family, being back in their own country. So, but anyway, the caste system was designed to help guarantee that if you were born into a caste, you'd stay there. So if you were born into a warrior caste, you were expected to become a soldier, whether you wanted to or not. If you were born into the priestly caste, you were expected to become a religious person, again, whether you wanted to or not. Now, we all do this in our minds. We look at people, and say, well, at least I'm not as bad as that person. I mean, it's a tendency we all have. Or we look at somebody else and, oh man, I wish I were as good as he did. That person's better than I am. It's a tendency we have. We classify ourselves as according to what we think of ourselves. We all do this in our minds. But in the case of India, they made it into a legal social system, much more so than anywhere else on earth, and made it difficult to move from one class to another. As was in the case of China, which we'll talk about next chapter, their life centered around what you call the extended family. In other words, not just your father and mother and brothers and sisters, but you were part of a family if you're descended from the same great-great-grandparents. So that meant that, in other words, the family was their family was what we might call a clan. It extended beyond just the immediate father and mother and children, but it also included first cousins, second cousins, and third cousins. They tried to keep the families together by religious rites, among other things. Marriage was often arranged, and folk, this is still true a lot in both India and China. Arranged marriages. The advantage to that is, I want to state this, being an American, we think arranged marriages are taboo. Who wants an arranged marriage? It's known in general throughout time that arranged marriages actually have a tendency to last better than marriages where you choose your spouse. And also, our custom, it appears to some people to be very, very wasteful. We spend a whole lot of time involved in dating activities, and also our dating customs can be quite painful. when you have a relationship that comes and in a few days it's broken up, get another one, it comes and it goes. Some of you might know what I'm talking about, and yes, I went through that same thing myself, and sometimes it gets quite painful and very time consuming and distracts you from your career. Okay. A lot of transcripts have lower grades on them than they otherwise would because of dating problems that arise. But again, and in no way am I promoting arranged marriages. I think our system is greater and better, but it's not without its problems. It's not without its hindrances. Now, your authors are going to spend every chapter we visit from here on out, chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5, talking about the role of women in our society. And in every case, they're going to tell you that women maintained an inferior position, that only the men could inherit property. In general, only the men could initiate divorce proceedings. All this is true, and the men were dominant. And when a woman married, she would leave the tribe she grew up with and go join her husband's tribe, or she'd leave her family and join her husband's family and spend the rest of her life with her husband's family. Again, all this is true. Now, folk, here's something I have to say. I said this to one class, and one of my more friendly female students quit me and never came back. But your authors are saying, never in one place. No, never. But they say it here a little and there a little in bits and pieces, and I don't even think they realize they're saying it. Here's what they're saying. The more equal the women were in a society. Oh, if you think I'm scared stiff, I am. The more primitive that society. Okay, I'll be quiet. Now, if anybody wants to comment, you're welcome. I'll be quiet. If you're afraid of it, at the topic, you can't be more scared of it than I am. Go ahead. In other words, tribal. All right, an example. Among the American Indians, before Columbus, their women were considered equal. They could inherit, well, there was no property, there was no money, but their women were equal to the men. And they tended to be tribal. And we'll talk about Vietnamese. The Vietnamese women were more equal than the women of most other societies. All right. That's what I'm talking about. Again, I don't even know if your authors realize that they're saying it. And they never say it in one place. It's just you take bits and pieces and compare it. I'll say this one time, get it out of my system, and I promise, unless somebody won't say it again. Yes?
I don't know if it counts, but I know in Spartan society, you said arranged marriages, right?
Yeah, arranged marriages.
A Spartan man can allude to want to marry a Spartan woman, but they have the right to refuse them if they can.
The women have the right, and most societies refuse to marry a man that they don't like, yes.
But in the case of the Spartans, if they were able to fight them off without being taken, then men can't do anything about it. Because both men and women were both trained to fight.
Yeah.
But if a woman could fight off the man and keep him off, then she wouldn't have to marry him.
You know, you're just telling me something I did not know. You're talking about the Greek city of Sparta. That was something I did not even know.
So if I were kind of embarrassed and get your ass kicked.
Well, now, yeah, something I wanted to say about Sparta now. The Spartans, for all practical purposes, eventually became extinct. And their city is nothing but a bunch of stone ruins, while their city of Athens has 2 million people. So to me, a lot about the Spartan society was wrong. Short-sighted. But anyway, I'll get into that in a couple of chapters, chapter 4. Now, I'll move on. As is true with most ancient societies, their income was based a lot on farming. In America today, 1 out of 20 persons, if even that many, are farmers. And they can feed not only all of Americans, but much of the rest of the world. There are only about 5 or 6 countries on earth that can grow more than they need, and the United States is one of those countries. But throughout most of history, the farmers did not have tractors and reapers and combines. So that meant that 90% of your people had to be farmers, which only left 10% to be tanners, blacksmiths, and government workers, priests, religious leaders. But again, the farmers, life was hard. And a lot of them were landless laborers, sharecroppers. We went through a period where we had a lot of sharecroppers here in the South. Sharecroppers are people who don't own the land that they farm. Instead, they work the land and then they take some of the profits, or they take the profits and split it up among them, except some of the profits have to go to the landlord, of course. But the climate in India was highly unpredictable, and that made for farming very rough, and still does. That part of the world is subject to a whole lot of storms. They call them monsoons. We might call them hurricanes. Monsoons. The dry seasons. Heavy rains. Oftentimes the rains didn't come on time, and when the rains were late coming, people would starve by the thousands. The state would do what the Bible mentions the Egyptian Pharaoh did, was store food in granaries during the good seasons to tide them over during the bad seasons. But even this did not always solve the problems. So what this did lead to, though, was a tendency toward government to be centralized, and maybe a tendency toward what we might today call socialism. All right, which takes us up to religion. The first thing we think of when we talk about Indian religion is the word Hindu. But now actually that word Hindu does not necessarily mean religion. The word Hindu has to do with anything that concerns India. Whether it be their religion, their caste system, or their social structure, whatever. It's just a broad word, but we Westerners tend to think of, the first thing when we hear the word Hindu is, oh, that's the religion of the Indian people. Now, at one time, originally, it seems like the Indian people worshipped a god called Shangdi. D-Y-A, Deus. That's Shangdi China. D-Y. Which some people believe is like this, comes from the Spanish Dios, or the Greek word deity, from which we heard. They originally worshipped one god, but after a while the god Deus began to seem to look very, very distant. And he was replaced by other gods and goddesses that came on the scene. Until today, India is known to have more than 1 million different gods. Now, again, if you talk to a man from India, he'll tell you, oh, we're really monotheists. I mean, if he knows you're a monotheist yourself, and he'll say, oh, we're really we just believe that all of these many gods are really part of the same one spirit. So there's one spirit behind them all, so we're really worshiping the same God. But he takes different forms. In this family, he manifests himself under this name. And in that family, he manifests himself under that name, but it's really all one and the same. But to most outsiders, they appear to be more polytheistic than hardly any other group of people. Each family has its own patron god, and there's a god for the rain, a god for farmers, a god for warriors. A key feature of Indian worship was asceticism. Or deprivation. In other words, ascetics believe that if you deprive yourself, now there's several ways that you can do this. Number one is, of course, do without food. Or number two is lie on a bed of spikes. Or number three, walk on a bed of hot coals. And they believe that this will take you out of your physical desires, which they look on as being evil. And put you in a spiritual realm or a spiritual state, an altered state of mind, and get you that way in touch with the gods. Now again, a lot of people have had this belief, folk, even among Christians, so don't think it's too strange. Yeah, your book mentions Christianity and Islam have practiced it, but it seems to have occurred very early in the religious tradition. Now, again, when I was in the Army and had some free time finally, at first I didn't have any, but when I had a little bit of free time, I saw a book lying around about the Hindu religion, so I picked it up and read it. It talked about this one man who held himself up with his arms straight up for 100 years in a extremely difficult position. And after 100 years, a God came to him and said, I'm going to make you ruler of 3 planets because of your asceticism, your holiness. Again, these are the kind of stories that circulate in their society. Another part of their belief is reincarnation. Reincarnation. In other words, when you die, you will come back to life again, reborn. And the purpose is that if you're not quite good enough in this life, you have to repeat until eventually you take on a life to where you are good enough to eventually you don't have to come back, and you reach the state of what we might think of as heaven, but a state of ultimate perfection. Now, they believed that all life was sacred, even animal life. That is why they will not eat, particularly will not eat beef, because they believe the cow either once was human or will become human. In other words, if you were pretty bad in this life, you might come back as a cow, and then if you came back as a cow 1 or 2 life cycles, then you might come back as a human again. So you did not always work your way up. Sometimes you had a setback of sorts. But now, again, they believed that all life was sacred, and they went to extreme lengths to protect all life, including, whenever possible, they even try to avoid killing poisonous snakes, because the poisonous snake might be a distant relative of theirs who is sort of bad. Now, I'm going to jump around a little bit in this part of the story because I have noticed, here in our own country, we have a lot of people who value the sacredness of all life, particularly animal. But folk, again, I can say some things that can get me into hot water, but I have noticed that a lot of people who value human life can have who value animal life. A lot of people who value highly animal life can have a very super cold attitude toward human life. And India was no exception. In India, compassion was totally lacking, and this was true up until modern times. Now, Mother Teresa did a lot to change some of that, but in India, when you became sick, they just simply put you on a separate house and forget about you and leave you to die. No care. And the trucks used to go around in India even as recently as 50 years ago, and I don't know if this still goes on. They looked for the dead bodies, persons who had dropped over dead, picked them up and carried them out to the dump and just dump them over. And if a person beside of you dropped down dead, you just, so what, keep on walking, pay no attention. That person apparently deserved it or has been pretty bad. And they just simply leave them alone until the truck came by, pick up the bodies and carry them to the dump. Compassion is known to be seriously lacking in among the Hindu peoples, the Indian people. Now again, if you think otherwise or have heard otherwise, your comments are welcome. Yes, human life, fooey on it. Animal life, oh no, we got to preserve it. It's sacred. And they preserved, particularly the cow. They had 4 times more cattle when I was a kid than any other country on earth. Enough cattle to completely alleviate all of their poverty. And they refused to eat them, refused to tan their hides But they would at least put shoes on and make them work. Put shoes like horses and make them plow. But they would not eat them because, again, the cow was sacred. The process of being reborn in the next life, karma. You might notice I wrote that in cursive again because that's a word from a foreign language. And folk, in your writing, when you're writing about the name of ships, names of ships are written in cursive, titles of books, magazine articles written in cursive, and foreign words you borrow, like this one, you write in cursive. Anyway, karma, the idea of rebirth. Now, we don't know how Hinduism formed. Some religions have a founder. Some religions have supposedly have a beginning. In the case of the Hindus, that had its beginning somewhere way far back in ancient history. And by the time there are written records, the religion appears to have been somewhat, I want to say full-blown, but no religion starts off full-blown, but pretty well developed. Again, no known founder. No known one person. All right, this takes us up to Buddha. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his real name, but I'm just going to call him Buddha. Now, when I was at Lockheed, I got into a little bit of a discussion with Boss. He said that this story seems to be impossible. Folks, this story has been told for 2,600 years, and you can decide what you want to believe about it or not. But anyway, according to the story, Buddha was the son of a king. And his father decided, I'm going to make sure that this young baby never experiences any grief or any sorrow. Which was actually one of the worst things that the father could have done for him. But this man's never going to have any grief, never going to have any sorrow. So he protected him all of his life. So he had his servants go ahead every time that young Buddha went for a walk. There'd be servants go around and they would chase away anybody who was poor, anybody who was sick. Now, folks, don't ask me what would happen if a cousin died, if a playmate died. I mean, I don't know how they handled that, but apparently this man never saw any sorrow, any grief, did not know what death was, did not realize that he was going to grow old and die someday. But one day, he was about 20 years old, and his servants just simply were not diligent enough. And Buddha happened to see an old man walking with a cane. He'd never seen an old man before. So he began to inquire, what is different about this man? Sir, he's lived a long time, and but I mean, are there a lot of people like this? Well, sir, well, they didn't know what to find on us. Everybody eventually becomes this way. You mean I myself am going to become? Yes, sir, you're eventually going to become like this yourself. The shock was so great it threw young Buddha into a state of terrible shock. He left his home, he wandered around, trying to find meaning to existence and meaning to life, and it's like reality hit him. I mean, it's just all of a sudden. Make a long story short, he eventually, after a lot of fasting and a lot of soul searching, he formed his own religion that has been known ever since as Buddhism. And Buddhism was to find its way into places like the Southeast Asia, where it became the dominant religion of places like Indonesia or in Vietnam, those parts of Southeast Asia. It made its way to China, and it even threatened to overrun Hinduism in India. In fact, Hinduism had to reform itself to keep people from completely leaving it. Buddha believed that you would eventually get into a state called Brahman, where that was the state of ultimate perfection. It was an offshoot from Hinduism. Nevertheless, it was different. And one of the differences was it was a little bit more egalitarian. That is, it even allowed the outcasts to join. The rituals were not as demanding as were the Hindu rituals. In fact, a lot of folk called it the middle path. Now, there were 8 rights that you'd find happiness if you got a right knowledge, right purpose, right speech, right conduct, right occupation, right effort, right awareness. Don't memorize those, folks. Just be aware. Just be advised. He believed if you did everything right, the right this, the right that, you would find ultimate happiness. Egalitarianism, again, much more so than Hinduism. Simpler. Now, when he died around 480 BCE, his followers did not write any of his sayings down for 200 years. Then finally this group over here said, well, he said this, and another group over there said he said that. The fact is, we really cannot be for sure what he said, because 200 years ago in our country, James Madison was president, and nobody alive remembers it. So after a time, his writings somewhat conflicted, what people said about conflicted, and we have a difficult time determining exactly what he said. Now, something else I want to make a remark about him. When my dad was talking to me about Buddha one time, he said, now some statues show him as being just like a human skeleton, skin and bone, and some show him to be very obese. And we don't know which ones are right. I think I know. Do any of you have any ideas? Which statues of them are right? The ones that show him to be obese or the ones that show him to be thin? Yeah.
Does it show him to be obese?
Partly. I think that they're both right. All right, a surefire way to obesity, like I just told you, is to fast. Hopefully I'm not the first person to tell you that. I mean, all right, you fast, you might lose 6 pounds and gain back 8. Lose 5 pounds and gain back 7. What fasting does for your body is it sets up your metabolism, puts your body in emergency mode to where that when